This is how you do a letter of intent on real estate investments that will win you more deals. Let's go! A letter of intent is simply a non-binding agreement between a buyer and a seller on a real estate deal where you basically just spell out all the major terms of an agreement before having to get attorneys involved and draw up a big purchase and sale agreement. Now in this video, we're going to go over all of the major terms that should be in a letter of intent that if you can get agreement on these terms, there's a very high likelihood that you'll get to a signed purchase and sale agreement, which is the binding agreement that you're looking for. Anytime you're turning in an offer, whether you're the only person offering or you're competing against others, the whole goal is to win over the seller. To win over the seller, there are three things that this letter of intent is trying to accomplish besides obviously turning in good price and terms. 1, you want the letter of intent to be short and concise. 2, you want to convey that you're someone who's going to be easy to work with. And 3, you want to convey that you're someone who's willing, able, and capable to close on this deal. As it relates to number 3, I highly encourage you to watch this video right here, which gives all the great tips and tricks of the most elite investors in the world and how they get their letter of intents accepted every time. Ideally, you want to try to get your letter of intent to fit on one page and no more than 2 pages. The more terms from a purchase contract that you use in a letter of intent, the more on alert the seller is going to be from the very beginning. And now we're going to begin the content and structure of this letter of intent, which by the way, in the link in the description down below, I give a copy of this letter of intent that you can use for yourself. The first item is the reference line, where you're going to reference the name and address of the property that you're after. And of course, you're going to be abundantly clear this is a non-binding contract. Next, you're going to point out who's going to draw up the purchase contract once the letter of intent has been agreed to. Typically, it's the purchaser who, of course, does the letter of intent and typically does the purchase contract. On occasion, however, you may find that if the seller is a very large organization that does transactions all over the country, sometimes they prefer to use their own template contract, even though you submitted the letter of intent. And I would just go along with that because they're probably much bigger than you are, and so therefore you want to play in their ball field. Next up, you're going to say who the purchaser is. Now, if you already have an entity form that you know you're going to buy this with, you're going to use that entity. If you don't know what the entity is that you're going to use, or you're going to create one during the period, as long as you put or assigns to a related entity with the same principal, that tells the seller, hey, there's no funny business here. I'm going to be the one who's going to buy it. If I go to a different company or create a new company, I'm still the guy who's going to be on it. And so you just want to point that out so they don't feel like you're going to flip this property to someone else later. Then you're going to list who the seller is, and you can find the actual entity name either on the county assessor's site or you can check the deed in the public records. Next up is the purchase price, which is probably the most important part, and there's really no jazz to this. You're just putting down a number. Next up is how you intend to pay for the asset. There's typically cash, financing contingency, or not conditioned on financing. Let me explain. Conditioned on financing means obviously you intend to get financing, and if you can't get approved, then you can't buy the property. Not conditioned on financing probably means you're going to get financing, but you're so confident that you're going to be able to get approved, probably because you have long relationships with a lending institution and vice versa, and they believe in you, that you're not going to make the asset conditioned on financing in order to be more attractive to the seller. And the last one is cash, which should mean that person's actually paying cash and getting no debt. But most of the time in multifamily investments, what that typically means is that they're probably getting financing. They're just not going to make it conditioned on financing. To the seller, it doesn't matter. It's really cash to them. All the seller really cares about is that the whole deal's not conditioned on financing is the ideal thing they want to see. Now, I'm not telling you to pay cash or make something not contingent on financing if you're not prepared for that. I'm just telling you in a perfect world, especially when you're competing with others, if that's possible, that's what sellers really look for. Next up, you're specifying the deposit structure. Typically, there's an initial deposit, which is put in right after the purchase and sale agreement is executed. Then there's a second deposit, which is after after the inspection period expires, and at that time, the initial deposit and the second deposit are now combined and they're non-refundable. That means you're heading to closing. Typically, each of those deposits are put in the escrow account within 1 to 3 days after that specific period is due. The elite investors that I've watched transact typically use deposits as a differentiator among the competition. Let me tell you what I mean. They know that sellers want to feel like you have enough skin in the game, i.e. deposit money, that you're not going to walk away. Elite investors know if they're going to move past due diligence to closing, they're already going to have to come up with 25 to 35% down to close on the deal. So on the letter of intent, they want to put down enough money so that the seller knows they ain't walking away based on that size of a deal. Now, next up is the inspection period. But before we jump into that, make sure you listen to this video, which is the 12 response times that elite investors use to win more deals. Several things I want to point out in the inspection period paragraph. Number one, of course, you're putting the number of days, but I highly encourage you to put calendar days. When I see business days in anything in a letter of intent, it kind of gives that feeling of trying to cheat the system a little bit, and it just puts the seller on alert. So if you want to be most competitive, I would use calendar days in everything you do. You're, of course, going to point out all the different tests and surveys that you're going to do on the property, but you're also going to point out that if you don't like what you see, in your sole discretion, that you want to have an immediate refund of your deposit. Now, the reason you want to use sole discretion words is that you want to point out that you have full control over the decision on whether or not you move forward. Then I see elite investors point out all the different due diligence documents that they're going to ask for in the purchase contract, and that does two things. One, it gives the seller a chance to review some of those documents and tell you whether or not they have them, so that you're going into the deal with eyes wide open. And two, it gives the seller a heads up of what you're looking for, so they can begin assembling documents right now, so that when a purchase and sale agreement is executed, day one, you've got everything you need. The items I have listed are the ones that I deem to be the most ideal to have day one when you start due diligence. If the seller doesn't have them all, that's not the end of the world. It just depends on which ones they don't have. Typically, a rent roll and at least 1 year of a P&L is the minimum to move forward. Next up is the closing period, which is quoted as the number of days after the inspection period. On occasion, I will see investors put in an extension clause, which basically allows them a one-time opportunity, sometimes 2 times, to extend the closing by a certain number of days. For that right to extend, they will put down an additional amount of deposits that also becomes non-refundable with the other deposits. Now, that extra deposit amount typically goes towards the purchase price, but on occasion, sometimes if investors want to be more competitive, they'll put it as a fee, which means it goes on top of the price for that right to extend. Next up is the commission clause, which is the most important clause in the entire document. Just kidding. It's simply pointing out who the broker is and which party is paying them. The majority of the time in investment sales, there's usually just a listing broker, which is typically paid by the seller. If there were also a buyer's broker involved, or only a buyer's broker involved, maybe it was an off-market transaction and the broker brought you directly to the seller, then you'll need to specify whether it's the buyer or the seller paying that broker. If there's a buyer's broker involved, I always encourage the buyer to pay that buying agent, because that makes you as the buyer look more attractive to the seller and the seller's agent. The reason is twofold. Sometimes the seller's commission agreement may specify a higher fee they have to pay if there's 2 brokers involved, and a smaller fee if his listing agent is the only one involved. Secondly, if the seller's agent doesn't have to share their fee with the buyer's agent, they're going to be more of an advocate for you as the buyer. Then there is typically a miscellaneous paragraph at the bottom, which basically specifies that the parties are going to work hard to go from a signed letter of intent to a signed purchase agreement in a certain amount of time. I would put in a little blurb to the seller that says that they won't negotiate with other parties during that period between letter of intent and contract. This is a non-binding agreement unless you specify otherwise for that specific clause, so they could still talk to other buyers, but it's a very small world in the investment world, and most sellers don't want to put their reputation on the line like that to bud you out by talking to others. And lastly, you're just putting a date line in the buyer and seller for signatures. From that period, once it's fully executed, that document is going to go to your attorney to draw up a purchase and sale agreement. If there are any other unique things that need to be entered into the letter of intent, like seller is providing financing or maybe you're doing a loan assumption, those should be entered in too. But for the most part, you're just trying to make the letter of intent as easy and attractive to the seller to choose you as possible. I hope the video was useful to you, and if you could think of any other things that you've put on a letter of intent that were ultra successful in getting you the deal, please let me know and comment below. See you on the next one.